Welcome to Drive the Daf. Clear, structured explanation of the daily Daf in 20 minutes. You can even follow in the car.
Yoma Daf. We begin quite a ways through the Daf, about 2/3 of the way through the first Amud, because we're beginning the third Perek of Maseches Yoma, Perek Amalem HaMamuna. The Mishnah describes how they checked to make sure that it was light before they began the avodah of the day, and then it continues by explaining why, how they exactly made sure, and then it discusses how the Kohen Gadol began the avodah. The Gemara will comment on the entire discussion that took place to make sure that the sun had really risen, and the Gemara will have a bit of a gadata along the way discussing Avram Avinu and his tefillah, and the fact that Klal Yisrael always had yeshivos. So we begin with the Mishnah. The Mishnah says that they wanted to make sure that the sun had risen. They did not want to do the korban atumid, the shechita, before the sun was up, and they wanted to make extra sure that the sun was up. They would send somebody up on the wall to a high place so they could check to make sure that the light that they're seeing on the sky was really sunlight. The Gemara said, the Mishnah explains the reason why they had to do that, because it once happened that they saw a light in the sky and they thought that the sun had come up, but really the moon had come up, and the moon was lighting up the sky, and therefore they went to check, and that was the custom that they did ever after. Now, what was the procedure? So the Gemara says the Mamuna, the one who was in charge, sent somebody up. As soon as he saw light in the sky, he said, go up and check and make sure that it's really light. So there's two versions as to what he said. The one who went up, according to the first version, he said that there is the Varkai, the shining one, referring to the sun. Second version comes from Masi ben Shmuel. Masi ben Shmuel, interestingly, was a Mamuna in the Beis HaMikdash himself, but here he's functioning as a Tana in the Mishnah. And he says, he reports what the conversation was. It's a bit confusing. The Gemara will explain who said what. So he says, they said, is the light up in the east all the way to Hebron? And he said, yes. Not sure who said what. The Gemara will explain it. Okay, after all this happened and they were sure that the sun was up, it was time to do the shechita. First, the Kohen Gadol had to purify himself. So the Gemara says that they took him to the mikvah, and he went down to the mikvah. Now the Mishnah concludes with two halachos. Who requires tevilah in the beginning of the day? Somebody who used the restroom, which the Mishnah calls mesaches raglav, covering his legs. Somebody who did that has to go to the mikvah. And that's if you use the restroom for solid waste. Somebody who used it for liquid waste only has to do kiddush yadayim v'raglayim, washing his hands from the kiyur. Okay, the Gemara begins here, and the Gemara has 5 Tanaim explaining what exactly was the statement that they said to say that the sun had risen. Rabbi Shmuel says that he said, Barak Barkai, the sun is shining. Rabbi Kiva said, Allah Barkai, the sun is up. Rashi explains that that's more, that's further in, that's more light. Nechuma ben Aphakshion said that the sunlight is all the way to Hebron. And Masi ben Shmuel, who we'd seen in the Mishnah, who the Gemara here calls Hamamuna al-Hapaisos, the one who was in charge of the lotteries that they did. So he reported that he had to say that the light stretches all the way to Hebron. Rabbi Yehuda ben Meir goes a step further, and he says the light goes all the way to Hebron, and people are already on the way to work. Right, as people are already on the way to work, that's deep into the morning. That's much further. So Gemara says, no, it's not that the workers are on their way to work. The employers are on their way to the places where the workers stand to go hire workers. That's what they're on the way to. Okay, the Gemara steps aside over here to discuss the time of the korban tamid shel bein arbaim, the afternoon korban tamid. So the Gemara says that Rav Safra says, at the time when Avram Avinu did tefillah, Rashi explains this is referring to tefillah's mincha. And even though Yitzchak was the one who was mataking tefillah's mincha, Avram also davened mincha. But the time for mincha is when the walls begin to blacken. Rashi explains it means when the east side of the wall begins to be in shadow. That's because the sun has passed the center of the sky. It's no longer directly overhead. It's closer to the west. It's just across the border between east and west. And therefore you have shade and shadow on the eastern faces of the walls. So the Gemara has a kasha on this. The Gemara has two versions of the kasha. The first version, the Gemara says that Rav Yosef says, what we should learn from Avram Avinu. That's an Avram Avinu daven. Avram Avinu was the biggest zaris there ever was. He was the most alacritous. I should learn from him when we should bring a karbanos. He daven mincha at that time. We can't bring a korban tamid so early. So Gemara says, why not? We're supposed to learn from Avram. We have a Tana that learns from Avram. It says, "B'yom hashmini yimul b'sar arlasa." You're allowed to do a bris milah anytime on the 8th day of the baby's life. But we learned from Avraham Avinu, he's supposed to do it first thing in the morning, like Avraham did it first thing in the morning. Like it says, "V'yashkem Avraham ba'abayka v'yachvosh." So you're supposed to do it first thing in the morning. So we are supposed to learn how to be alacritous, how to have zrizas from Avraham Avinu. Why not? So the Gemara says, okay, you're right, that wasn't the kasha. The kasha was that we have a Mishnah, the first Mishnah, Psachim, that seems to say that we didn't do it for as soon as the wall became in shadow. Because when did that shadow happen? That was right after Chatzos. A minute after midday, the sun's already tilted to the west, and you have shadow on the east side of the walls. But we saw that the halacha there is the earliest you could ever do the carbon Talmud Shel Bein Arbayim was half an hour after Chatzos. And the reason why we wanted it to be so early then, that was a Erev Pesach that came out on Erev Shabbos, where you had to do all the roasting before sundown. So they had to fit in the Korban Talmud plus all the Korbanos Pesach afterwards, and still the earliest we would do was half an hour after Chatzos. So obviously we don't go as early as you're saying that Avraham Avinu did, that he went all the way from a minute after Chatzos. So Gemara says that it was different. Avram was able to do it earlier, and there's two possible reasons. First of all, the walls of the Beis Hamikdash were slightly sloped, at least on the eastern side, and the reason is that they tapered as they went up, so they weren't straight. So when the sun was 1 minute past Chatzos, it would still be shining on the wall, on the eastern edge of the wall, because it's sloped. It wouldn't be in shadow until it went further, until it was half an hour after Chatzos. Another explanation is that Avram knew the movements of the stars and the sun very well, and he was able to tell when it was exactly a minute after Chatzos. We did not have that b'kiyas, we don't have that knowledge, and therefore we have to make sure that we don't accidentally end up before Chatzos, so we go all the way to half an hour after Chatzos. Now the Gemara says, Avraham Avinu was a zaken v'yeshiv b'yeshiva. He was an elder who sat and he learned, and that's why he knew all these things. And then the Gemara proves that Klal Yisrael always had yeshivas, and that's because all throughout Klal Yisrael's history you find the term zaken, which is something that shows that somebody was an elder who was sitting and learning in yeshiva. And the Gemara quotes a number of sources of this. The Gemara quotes the pasuk that says Lech v'yasafta ziknei Yisrael. You see, you had zikanim. Where was that? That was in Mitzrayim. So you had zikanim in yeshiva in Mitzrayim. In the Midbar they had zikanim. It says Asvali Shivim Ishmi Ziknei Yisrael. Avraham Avinu was a zaken. It says, like it says, Avi Avram zaken ba bayamim. Yitzchak Avinu was a zaken, like it says, Vayhiki zaken Yitzchak. Yaakov Avinu was a zaken. It says Ve'eni Yisrael kavdu mi zaken. Eliezer Eved Avram was called a zaken. He was also there for Yeshiv and Yeshiva, just like everyone else on the list here. Like it says, Va'avra Ve'emer Avram al Avdai Zikan Beisei Moshe b'chol asher loi. So Gemara says, by the way, what does Moshe mean? Moshe means Shem Moshe b'teirasei. Moshe b'chol asher loi means he knew all his learning. All of Avram's Torah, Eliezer knew. Also, he's called a domestic Eliezer from the phrase Dolo Mashke, that he drew and poured out all of Avram's Torah. He taught other people the Torah of Avram Avinu. Now the Gemara comments on Avram Avinu's level. The Gemara says, Rav says Avram Avinu was Mekayim Kol HaTorah Kul. He kept all the mitzvos in the Torah, like it says, Eikav Asher Sham Avram B'Koili. Avram kept listened to all of my voice, and it quotes mitzvos sai v'seirasai. It says my mitzvos and my Torahs, he kept them all. The Gemara says he listened to the voice. That just means that he did the mitzvos. How do you know he did all 613? Maybe it means he did all the ones that he was commanded, all the seven mitzvos b'nei Noach. Gemara says, well, first of all, he for sure did more than that, because we know he did bris milah. Bris milah is not one of the seven. So Gemara says, okay, so he did 8. But where do you see that he did all 613? So Gemara says, no, because it says mitzvah sai v'seirasai, all my mitzvahs, all my Torahs. That implies he did all of them. The Gemara goes further and says, Avram Avinu, he kept even the mitzvahs derabanan, even the minhagim. He did even erev tafshilin. Like you say, like it says, Torah say my Torahs. What's my Torahs? Torah Shabbat Peh and Torah Shabbat Ksaf. He did both of those. Okay, the Gemara refers back to the Mishnah where we had seen the quote of Masya ben Shmuel, who had the whole conversation where he went up on the wall. He said that the sun came up. Is it till Chevron? It is till Chevron. It isn't till Chevron. He said yes. Who said what? So the Gemara says there's some phrases missing in the Mishnah. The Mishnah said he said till Chevron, and he said yes. So the Gemara says who's speaking here? We did not differentiate. It was one person talking and someone else speaking. So if the person on the wall asked, did it go till Chevron, and he answered yes, so he's answering his own question. It's a little strange. And if he asked, did it go to Chevron? And the person who was on the floor answered yes. So how is he supposed to know? He's not on the wall. So what's going on? So the Gemara says two versions of this. Either the one who was on the floor asked, did it go all the way to Chevron? And the person who was up on the wall answered yes. Or the person on the wall said, do you want to know if it goes all the way to Chevron? Meaning the one on the floor said, is the light up? And the one on the wall said, it's up, and if you want to know, it's going all the way to Chevron. And the one on the floor said, yes, that's what I wanted to know. I wanted to know if it goes all the way to Chevron. Now, Rashi explains why are we trying to go out of our way to mention Chevron here. So Rashi explains that we're trying to bring out the schus of the Avos who lived in Chevron. Therefore, they had this conversation, which was an extra way to mention Chevron and bring it into perspective. The Gemara asks, there's something strange over here. They had to go up on the wall to check that it was really the sun that was rising because you're saying that at one time the moon came up and therefore the sky lit up in the east and they thought it was the sun, was really the moon. The Gemara says, that's strange. The moonlight looks different than the sunlight. The moonlight comes up in a straight beam and the sunlight spreads out all over. So how could they get confused? So the Gemara says the day that it happened, that they got confused, was a cloudy day. And there were a couple of breaks in the clouds all over. And therefore the moonlight came shining out through the breaks. And therefore it appeared to be all over. And it appeared like the sunlight, which spreads all over. The moonlight spread because there were clouds all over. So you see from here that when it's cloudy, it spreads light all over. It also spreads heat all over. And therefore on a cloudy day, the heat of the sun is equally spaced all around. In even a place which on a sunny day might be in shade and shadow, it might be cool, on a cloudy day the heat will affect it. The Gemara says, why do I need to know that? The Gemara says there's two reasons. First of all, if you're spreading out things to dry, on a cloudy day it could spread in all places, it'll be equal heat. Also, we know the halacha that you're not supposed to knead a dough in the sun on Pesach because it could become chametz faster because it could heat up. So you shouldn't do that at all on a cloudy day because it could heat up anywhere. Now the Gemara has a few statements of Agarata that's related. The Gemara says Rav Nachman says that the heat of the sun when it's cloudy and it's spreading is worse than the actual sun itself, worse than the actual shine of the sun itself. And the simon to remember that is like a bottle of vinegar. When you pop open the vinegar, so the smell comes out strongly. In the same way, the heat of the sun, when it pops out from between the clouds, it comes out stronger than if it was just a clear day and it was spread out shining all over. Next, the Gemara says blindness, which is caused by seeing the sun at a break in the clouds, is worse for your eyes than blindness of just seeing the sun plain on a clear day. And your sign for that, to remember that, is like drips. If you are in a bath of water, it's not going to bother you so much. But if water keeps dripping on you in one spot, that's going to hurt. So when the sun comes peeking out through the clouds in one spot, that'll have a worse effect on your eyes. Next, the Gemara says that the Hirhure Avera is worse than an Avera itself. So the Gemara, there's different versions in the Rishonim of how to understand that. It might mean that an Avera that's done in the mind, or the desire after an Avera that one is unable to reach. But either way, the Avera is sometimes, the thought process involved in the Avera is sometimes worse than the Avera itself. The Gemara says that your sign to remember that is the smell of roasting meat. Somebody who can't eat roasting meat, smelling it might be worse for him than just avoiding it altogether. Even though he's avoiding it, but just the smell can be very difficult for him to bear. Next, the Gemara says the end of the summer, heat-wise, is worse than the entire summer before. You have the compilation of all the heat that's gone before it. And the way to remember that is from an oven. A hot oven, an oven which has been fired throughout the day, is much hotter than if it's just been fired for the first place. The Gemara also says that a fever that somebody gets during the winter is worse than a fever that somebody will get during the summer. And the way to remember that is because a cold oven takes a lot more fire to heat it up. And yet, if it gets hot, it must be driven by a lot of fire and heat. So if somebody gets a fever during the winter, it must be driven by a lot more fire and heat than it is during the summer. Then he says that it's actually harder to learn something that you once knew and forgot than it is to learn something new for the first time. The way to remember that is, if you want to make cement, it's better to use fresh sand that was never made into cement in the first time, rather than to use regular old cement that was already made and ground up and then try to make it into cement again. That's going to be more difficult and less sturdy.
Drive the Daf is a project of the Grand Woodlands Shul and is presented by Rabbi Yitzchak Landa. Find us on YouTube or subscribe to daily emails by emailing drivethedaf@gmail.com.